The world is changing faster than you can imagine. The old systems are collapsing. Join us as we delve into the minds driving the future, the Clean Titans.
Welcome back to Clean Titans. We often talk about building a sustainable future. Our guest today argues that future is not something we transition to slowly. It's something that explodes into existence. We believe the deepest, fastest, and consequential transformation of human civilization in 10,000 years is happening right now, driven by technology. Our guest is James Arbib, co-founder of the renowned think tank RethinkX and founder of the Helios Matter Foundation. James, welcome to the channel.
Thank you very much indeed. It's great to be here.
Your fundamental thesis, co-authored with Tony Seba, is that we are on the cusp of an age of superabundance. Let's start with the big, bold claim. What is the single biggest misconception that policymakers and investors hold about the pace of the clean energy transition?
So the transformation that's coming, energy is the key pillar on which everything else sits. But also important is a transformation of labor, what we call artificial labor, so robotics plus AI. But really what we're missing and what we're failing to see, two things, if I can be greedy here and divert your question. First and foremost, we're failing to see the speed and scale of disruption, right? So disruptions, we've studied well over 1,000 disruptions through history now, and they tend to happen extremely quickly. From 10% of the market, say to 80%, generally in somewhere between 10 and 15 years, right? It happens quick. Actually, there's evidence that the speed of change or the speed of disruption is speeding up. But the second thing that we fail to understand is the nature of disruption, right? We tend to see disruptions as a substitution, right? We switch out one technology for another, but all else remains the same. But actually what technologies tend to do is explode the possibility space, right? They change what's possible. And they're not just a simple substitution of technology, but they're fundamentally transformational. And they change a whole host of other things as well. Society reorganizes around the new paradigm. And I'm sure we can dig in a bit deeper to both those points.
You've talked about how institutions and incumbents always fail to see disruption coming. You cite historical examples like the French military missing the strategic value of the airplane because they were stuck in 19th century military strategy.
Yes, so we tend to see the world through the lens of today, right? We understand what you might term the possibility space of today. So I'll give you a separate example of the French before World War II is a great one, where we're looking at the technologies of the day, design their defenses around what they expected to happen if Germany were to invade. And of course, they failed to foresee airplane, which could just go straight over the top of them, or they failed to see the speed of the tanks and military vehicles that the Germans had produced. And a good example of that mindset or that viewpoint that's rooted kind of the old system, the old capability set. You see it in all kinds of domains. You see it in terms of opportunities, right? We're seeing, for instance, incumbent car manufacturers being totally outcompeted by Tesla, by the Chinese, by those on the edge who had an advantage of a clean slate. They didn't have a kind of incumbent business to protect. They didn't have an incumbent mindset, an incumbent view of what the possibility space was. Organizations of the incumbent car companies that were eking out incremental improvements, right, to their existing technology. And that was a whole focus. They've been totally by those companies that started with a clean slate and built something entirely different that's now both cheaper and better than anything incumbent car manufacturer, and they're left behind, right? They're left for dead. And you see it in all kinds of ways, right? You see it also when we're trying to solve our problems, when we think about the environmental problems that we're trying to solve today. We're trapped in the kind of space of today. And what we're trying to do essentially is turn the world a bit less bad. Right? We're trying to make things a little bit better. And so, use a bunch of band-aid solutions, band-aid treatments, not solutions at all. They can't possibly hope to cure the environmental problems, at least or the social problems that we face today. And in our view, occurring now is there's an explosion in the possibility space, right? That we're just seeing the possibilities that are beginning to emerge. So if you're looking backwards or looking at today and looking at the existing possibility space, you're missing out on a huge opportunity space that's opening up that's going to transform everything. And that's really the danger that comes with incumbents just focusing on themselves. And what they're really failing to see, the speed of improvement of technology, right? They're failing to see, say, the cost curve. So this is what we see in the energy space today. Failure to understand how quickly solar can go from being high cost 30 or so years ago to being the lowest cost form of energy generation on the planet in most parts of the world today, because we've been on this extraordinary cost curve. And Tony always describes these cost curves as being like gravity, right? People always think that they're going to stop. And so you see these models that extrapolate improvement forward a couple of years and then kind of off. But actually we get cumulative, we get better and better at doing things. And we're finding, in many ways, these cost curves are like gravity. They continue irrespective of anything. It's not for me to prove gravity to you. It's for you to prove that gravity doesn't exist if you disagree with that. And so, first failure is to see the rate of improvement, and also to understand it's not just an improvement in cost, right? Get ever more competitive economically. It's also the capabilities that improve, right? So we're seeing, look at electric vehicles, right? They're not just getting cheaper, but they're getting better in all domains. We're seeing longer lifetimes. We're seeing greater energy density in the batteries. We're seeing greater capabilities all around. Soon we'll see, autonomous vehicles, which add a whole other layer of capabilities on top. And we'll
was in Las Vegas in September for RE Plus, and right in the middle of the conference, Amazon started debuting public 5 locations, Amazon Zook pods. And I wrote in one and I made a video about it. And later I made another video. And, as the bankruptcy of many companies, I'm afraid, Amazon, Waymo, and Tesla are going to cause the bankruptcy of the entire auto industry.
Yeah, for sure. And other industries, around them, because, that space that's opening up is a fundamental
I short video, a few minutes long, talking about that, if cars were self-driving on the road, it would save $1 trillion and bring the cost down to a quarter and save lives in 1 year. No garages, no more parking lots, no cars.
Yeah, that's right. So, the thing that Tony and I did was to write up on the disruption of transportation, and exactly that case. This was back in 2017. We were crazy back then for the kind of disruption we were seeing. But we made the argument, look, is once we get autonomy working well enough, right? Once it's good enough, it will cause a transformation that we're not seeing. This is not just a case of, still gasoline vehicle for an electric one and then an autonomous electric one, right? It disrupts the whole of car ownership. It changes everything. And you get, we think actually in cities, we'll get to a model where transport's free, essentially. Because these vehicles, the incentive today to back this, but the lifetime of an electric vehicle already today is about 1 million miles, right? For both the battery and the, and drivetrain. And that's without an incentive to vehicle that lasts forever. And so if you can spread the cost of the vehicle over 1 million miles in a kind of robo-taxi fleet, the per mile of transport, flights to zero, especially when you have this clean energy revolution alongside it, and you very little maintenance cost and no driver costs. So you end up with this.
Amazon could be selling all their products while you're riding as well. Google can help you do search or whatever, and make money off of YouTube.
Yeah, and we jokingly in a report sort of speculated about, well, what becomes possible when you have this capability, right? Because it's not just a substitution, right? There are all kinds of things that become possible. I mean, do you need to go to the shops, or do the shops come to you? Do you have like on wheels that run kind of that free transport if you buy a drink on the way? I mean, they're so cheap that we'll find other ways to monetize the service that mean that it's free.
I was just telling my aunt here in Chicago yesterday that from the driveway to Costco, just pressed a button in my car, and it reversed out onto a busy street all on its own, and then drove all the way there, parked itself, just had to press a button on my phone, and it came and picked us up from the front of the Costco, and then brought us back and parked in the driveway. No intervention whatsoever.
We're getting very close to the point where good enough. And it takes autonomy to unlock the real benefit of electric vehicles, which is their long lifetime and low degradation, low maintenance costs, because you don't need 1 million miles, right? It's miles a year, it's a 100-year car, right? It's pointless. So no one thinks about that, but that's really relevant when the car is doing 100,000 miles or 150,000 miles a year. And trapped in the old model, you just don't even think about that.
People a week did you drive your car? And because as an economist and data scientist, I know that 1 to 5% for most people. And your second biggest asset's just sitting there doing nothing for nobody for 95 to 99% of the time. That's a terrible waste of resources.
Yeah, absolutely. We need a fraction of the vehicles, and we'll have overabundance of transport, right? We'll design a fleet, and wait for peak demand during the rush hours and so on, and then the rest of the time we'll have these vehicles that can do all kinds of useful work, and that will certainly be kind of, whatever use cases. I mean, about these disruptions is you can't always see the new use cases and applications that actually create value in the system. It's like internet came along, right? You've imagined at the outset all of the things that would be built on top of that platform, right? The uses and applications of super abundant information. We saw maybe at that point that it was just a quicker way to send a letter. In fact, you see that in the naming conventions, right? We call it email, right? Electronic mail, essentially, because that's what we perceived it to be. Right? But of course, we're capable of doing all kinds of different stuff, but you couldn't have imagined. And I think as we see this labor disruption, the transport disruption unfold, be utterly transformational in ways we can imagine today.
Defining the S-curve for our investor audience, can you break down the Rethink framework? What is the mathematical tipping point where a slow incremental shift suddenly accelerates to the vertical part of the S-curve?
Yeah, when you track, 1,000 disruptions as we have, some very clear patterns that you can derive from disruptions, and it's exponential in the first part of the curve. Right? And so in the early days, it looks like nothing. It's a tiny fraction of the market. And even if it's still not making a dent in the market until it gets to a kind of point of materiality, I guess, where actually 20 or 50% over years actually begins to really make an impact, and to a point relatively early on, at maybe 20%, where it becomes unstoppable, right? Where we get to the point where industry is going into essentially a death spiral, right? That essentially drives their demise, right? They have to sell less, like 10, 20% of the market's been eaten. It drives down their margins, right? They can't compete. Their costs actually begin to go up. They get kind of reversing of scale. Deception begins to change. Maybe regulation begins to change against them. There are all kinds of things that kind of feed each other that drive them essentially to an inevitable demise. Whereas, the industry faces that kind of virtuous cycle, scale, lower cost, more demand and more intelligent, bright people coming into the industry and so on, and kind of virtuous cycles that disruption inevitable. So it's only by understanding those feedback loops that you can really understand what's driving that S-curve. And of course, you get to actually, it begins to slow down because you're towards saturation, and that's what gives it the S shape. But often is way, way big, right? I mean, you think of disrupting the horse, right? It went through a beautiful S curve, and it went from, a market from 95% of the market in America in just 20 years, right? So in that critical phase, 10 to 80% was about or so. And but a market that came out the other end of there's an order of magnitude bigger than the market for transport before, right? So we saw by, say, 1925, about a 10x increase in the numbers of miles traveled on American roads. And so it wasn't just a substitution, it was a creation of a different marketplace.
Waymo is already over 200,000 rides per week, and the Chinese counterpart is 250,000. And Waymo is going to double their cities next year.
Yeah, I mean, to London. I don't know if you...
Yeah, I mean to DC, I think in January, and Miami, Atlanta, and Tokyo. I don't know, when are they coming to London?
I think it's early next year as well. But it's getting to the point now where good enough.
Today, Nissan's death was downgraded to junk status.
Is that right? Yeah, and little those car companies can do, right? I mean, articles about the European car manufacturers, and you look at the agreements they have, right, where, they're not able to cut back, right? So they're kind of trapped. If you begin to see a decline in vehicle sales, and there are other premium European brands, an awful lot in China, it's just a really difficult situation for them. It's very difficult for them to adapt. They've got incredible competitors, right? And it's a much more open and dynamic market than it ever was before. And I think, hide behind tariffs for a bit and for industries, but ultimately it makes them less competitive, right? And delay the demise for a while. But the opinion is that it's a really difficult position right now for those businesses that adapt.
Let's turn to cost curves versus policy. You argue that technology cost curves are like gravity. How much does policy truly matter when solar, wind, and battery costs are plummeting rapidly?
deny the importance of policy, certainly in the early days of technology. So, one of the major reasons why solar is so competitive today and is taking such a dominant share of the new generation market is that the Chinese and the Germans actually, so years ago, had policies that adoption that essentially brought the cost curve forwards, pushed down the prices, kickstart that, the being at the top of a big mountain or the top of a big slope. But you need to give it a push to get it moving. And that was the kind of push. And then gravity is essentially the market forces that mean it gets ever competitive against the alternatives. And that's what we're seeing today. So, become less and less important. But subsidized solar now can compete. I mean, we've still got issues, purely free market. Solar would just totally outcompete and batteries, so the other key technologies, would totally outcompete the generation, legacy for generation. But we've got these that are designed for them, right? They're designed for a totally different paradigm. And so you've got this kind of mismatch between these sort of new distributed technologies and this kind of centralized, unidirectionals that are built around the old technologies. And so, this extraordinary situation right now where, it's down 90% over the last decade. Right, solar is through the roof around the world, including actually in sort of trying to resist it, like America or Europe or parts of Europe, rather. So we've got solar adoption through the roof, and yet consumer prices are going up pretty much everywhere. And really strange phenomena. But what's happening is that we're basically trying to shoehorn these technologies into the old structures, the old market structures, the old regulatory frameworks, infrastructure, and they just don't fit very well. So you have this kind of, well, we're not capturing the benefits of these new technologies in terms of the low cost and the flexibility and the security they could give us, and experiencing a bunch of problems directly from that mismatch. And so talk about policy, the required now are less about fiscal, they're less about subsidy. They're much more about, it's more than anything, and about kind of and allowing this disputed system to emerge. Right? And I think that's the key to the energy disruption.
I was reading this New York Times post yesterday about energy, and they're saying solar is now virtually the cheapest form of energy all over the world.
Yeah. I mean, it's places like Pakistan, right, where people are on their rooftops, right, because the kind of doesn't work very well, and it's cheaper. There's now more solar on the top of people's roofs, essentially, than there is from the grid in Pakistan, and happened at extremely short time. So we're seeing this system, but it's a vicious cycle as well.
They have tube wells in the rural area all over the country to suck water out of the ground. And now I saw this short video of a guy on a donkey cart with 6 solar panels. He goes up to the tube well, connects it, creates a pool of water, then goes to the next one.
Beautiful. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. But let's turn to energy abundance thesis.
Yeah.
Let's focus on solar wind batteries superpower disruption.
Okay.
Your analysis suggests that 100% clean electricity is not only physically possible, but economically affordable across the world by 2030. This sounds counterintuitive to conventional wisdom, which says we need massive, expensive nuclear or fusion or hydro or something else.
Yeah. So squarely in the box of, the current, you kind of come to an all of the above approach, right? You kind of need everything, right? You don't, solar and wind can do it alone, right? There's intermittency. Right? You don't get much solar in the winter time in the Northern Hemisphere, certainly, or at night. So you need to move, energy essentially summer to winter. And that's an expensive thing to do, right? Storage of that scale is hugely expensive. And so, that's why it's kind of this dystopian system emerging, where we're trying to shoehorn those new technologies into, we're kind of plugging gas and plugging in solar, right? And to think about it. So we asked ourselves the question, well, is it if you build a system on, that is wind and batteries, right? It turns out there are an incredible number of ways you can do that. One end, you kind of do what we're today, right? Where you unplug gas and coal and plug in solar. And then you need this sort of huge amount of storage. And that's a really expensive system at that end of the possibilities. The other way you can do it, the other extreme, is to just massively overbuild solar, right? So that you size your system essentially for the darkest day of winter. And no one's kind of thinking about it. It goes against everything that we think about. We see it as wasteful. We see it as we see a problem to curtail energy. And so, but when your system for the darkest day of winter, right, you can do that economically because this solar cost curve, continues into you can overbuild, right? It's just still cheaper than building a huge amount of storage, and it's certainly cheaper than the current system. But what happens when you do that is that every other day of the year, other than the darkest day of winter, you get an oversupply of electricity. You get more electric power than we currently need or have uses for, right? And that's an enormous opportunity, right? Because the system in continental US would be 3 or bigger in terms of energy production over the course of the year as today's system. So you've got this, suddenly you're in this world of energy superabundance, right? Where that energy is, that over, at least at the beginning, is free when it really have uses for it. But an economy, self-organizing, adaptive system, right? And people, entrepreneurs, others will find uses for that energy. For that, right? We'll find all uses, not industries and our current kind of production methods to take advantage of that, right? Energy-intensive industries will change to be able to use that flexible or design themselves for flexible demand to take advantage of essentially abundant free energy. But that's the sort of the least thing, right? Really, all those things we can't even imagine today, but the kind of things that we could do. I mean, we can some of those things, right? There are industries like vertical farming, right, which today are just not economically competitive, right? High cost because energy is something like the input costs, right? But with free energy, right, it becomes absolutely competitive, right? And you have, so you're operating in this whole different possibility space with super abundant, and we'll find uses. I mean, it's exactly after we basically had super abundant, essentially free. We essentially with compute as well at some level. I mean, certainly free compared to decades before. It depends so much that it is essentially abundant. We find uses for that, and that we think the value in the system will be. It's not in kilowatt hour, right? It's in the uses and applications you find to put that surplus energy to. That's what will create competitive advantage at a kind of system level. Our thesis. Different countries move towards that space. No one's got there yet, but there's still not a recognition. And it changes everything about how you think of the system then, right? I mean, we talk about a waste of energy. In today's terms, waste is using energy or more energy, using energy inefficiently when we need. And that kind of model, where the system that you've installed is just producing energy, when the sun or wind blows. Waste actually not using all the energy that's going to be produced anyway. That's a totally different way of kind of thinking about, conceiving it. It's a functionally different system. And I think that's the challenge we face, is we just can't get our minds out of that old system to see this exploding possibility space.
And then in the transition, you have electric cars in your garage. You can just use that whenever there's less supply. To fill in the gaps. And there's products now, bulbs here. I was in New York for New York Climate Week, and there was a company with a cooking range that has massive batteries in it. It's really designed for converting a gas stove to a induction cooking stove where there's no wiring in the house. There's no circuit breakers, nothing. And so you can pretty much just plug it into a regular wall socket, and it'll just store the energy and use that energy for this oven. The induction doesn't use power anyway, so it doesn't need a separate line. So then the cost of upgrading all the systems in the house, you can get a induction battery-powered cooking range that can also be a backup home battery for if there is a power outage.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, a whole different bunch of possibilities. And there is a transition pathway there, a transformation pathway there. This is all ultimately advantage, right? This isn't about trying to solve climate change, the energy transformation, right? This is actually just about better and more capable and cheaper technology outcompeting older technology. And it's a classic case of disruption. And a byproduct of that is that that's a piece of the puzzle. I don't know if you wanted to get onto labor, the disruption of labor with, AI and robotics. But that's another experiment.
AGI. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very hot topic, but I guess our perspective, we probably don't have much to add to the broader debate, but just about the system transformation is where we focus. And, what we see with the term which is artificial labor, so robotics plus AI. What we see with artificial labor is the same dynamic. We'll be able to perform more of what we do. But, it's not about substitution. Not about just doing your job or doing the job as driving a truck or working. This is initially but it's about transforming the possibility space, right? It's about all that we can do with that form of labor that we can't as humans possibly do. And it just creates this extraordinary position. And again, we're going to have super abundant labor, right? We're going to have super abundant intelligence and robotics, because as we begin to use more and more, just those physical more work, as we have software upgrades, and then as we redesign them and improve them, the atoms and molecules embodied will essentially produce more and more output over time. So we'll have a superabundance of labor and a superabundance of energy. And that's the possibility space we're moving into. And that's where the opportunities are. What can you do with what transforms, right? Everything in our world. Think about the dishwasher in your house or the whatever. It's all the possibility space of today, where we have scarce and high cost labor and scarce and high cost energy. So they're all about energy efficiency or labor, because that's the space in this world that's got super abundant labor and intelligence and energy. Transformational in terms of how we do anything and how we solve our problems.
Yeah. Next year, the robots will be in the homes. So
yeah, we're getting very close to the point, and the cycle improvement is extraordinary.
Yeah. If energy becomes super abundant at near zero marginal cost, what does that fundamentally change about the way every other business operates? Give us an example of an industry like water desalination or materials recycling that becomes entirely defined by cheap, abundant energy.
I mean, I'm limited in answering this question, right? But water desalination, is a great use of superabundant energy, because, you basically use it, turn the system on. Energy is available, essentially. It doesn't need to run 24/7. You can store water, at least to some degree. And so, very well, that will lower the cost, because the energy cost of a huge chunk of your operating costs, right? And if you take that out, it suddenly becomes viable, right? So that, for large swathes of the world, becomes a really important use case, a really important technology. You could make diamonds. I mean, industries where energy is a high proportion of operating costs presumably get disrupted first. Just change all the use cases we just can't see. We talked earlier about vertical farming. I can imagine what we're going to do, but there'll be entrepreneurs somewhere trying to solve some kind of problem who suddenly thought this is now, it wasn't before. And that capacity about that place is kind of great.
Absolutely. Your solar can be making water all the time whenever there's abundant solar or wind, right?
Absolutely, and you could be planting. You could be doing, other things to sequester. You can care about the atmosphere. You could be looking after old people. I mean, it's like, you could things that become possible that just aren't today.
Make diamond computer chips.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much every industry. It's a whole. I don't think we appreciate how fundamentally different that is.
Yeah, the maximized mindset. You've touched the idea that in a world of energy abundance, we must shift our mindset from minimizing energy use, scarcity, to maximizing it, superabundance. How challenging is it to get policymakers and the public to adapt a maximizing mentality?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really do, right? Because we're so ingrained in the current system is the system we have today, right? So it is a task of imagination to put yourself into the world I've been describing and we've been talking about. It's just not really here anywhere in the world yet. We just don't have those exemplars yet. We will take a few years, and it's something you could do actually if you saw this opportunity space. You could do really quickly. Here's the thing, right? Even though it's really dissuade, say, my government in the US or big swathes of America are resisting these technologies right now, actively resisting them, where there's just and that incumbency is a mindset level. It's the interest, economic. It's kind of just how the system is, right? There's just a lot of inertia and resistance in the system. Makes it really hard for those kinds of countries to lead on this. But here's the thing, right? Somewhere we'll do this, we'll build this system, right? And they will have the lowest cost form of energy on the planet, right? They'll have the lowest cost energy on the system on the planet. Right? So they'll attract investment, they'll attract industry, they'll attract growth, but they'll have it to the paradigm, right? Where they can develop those use cases and applications, right? That they're going to come in that space, right? Which will have huge value. So there's a real advantage to leadership here. If you lead on this and you create that system, and you don't have to do it at national level or at grid scale, you can do it at city level, right? Because these are much more distributed technologies. Right? So you can do it at much smaller scale. So, it just takes a handful of soil to do this. And they'll start that's because, they'll begin to and those countries that are themselves and their dysfunctional high cost energy system will just get out competed, and they'll be so, it's super difficult to change.
Uruguay, when Russia invaded Ukraine and the fossil fuel spiked, it didn't bother them. It didn't throw their budgets out and they didn't go bankrupt. And they're exporting the renewable energy now. With renewable products.
That's beautiful. Yeah. And you have, right, you throw energy, right, as essentially indefinitely into the future. And got this incredible, and not exposed to have the geopolitical issues. You've got none of them. And if you build it, you don't build it in a centralized system. Right, you've got a much more resilient system where one node can drop out and affect the whole system. So I mean, you've got benefits that are not least economically, and it's kind of insane doing in much of the way, which is to resist this. Right, and actually, if I look at America, and I use it's the world's greatest country, but on the end there's resistance to clean energy. Right, one critical pillar that underpins this transformation and underpins the next era that's coming. And you look on the left, and there's an emerging resistance to artificial labor, right, to AI, ostensibly to protect jobs, right? You can't do that. That just doesn't work. And so both sides, resisting, what do you get when you're trapped inside the box, arguing about the best way to patch up the system? And you need to get your head out of that box entirely, just transcend that space and what's coming. And you don't have to one off against the other, right? You build a system, a superabundance of energy and labor. And my God, you've got the most extraordinary opportunities for your economy. It's just most exciting, essentially energy and labor, the underpinnings of wealth. That's what wealth is. Money is. It's a capacity to harness land and labor. You've got superabundant. We'd have to really screw it up, not on the back of them.
Well, in red Texas, they're so cost effective and they can make so much money. Solar and wind are booming. And batteries are booming, and the great grid is batteries. Recently, there was a spike it was saved by battery storage, and there's more people working in renewable energies in Texas than in fossil fuels now. It's
magnificent, isn't it? I know, more jobs, lower cost, greater security. I mean, where do you stop? Right? Like this is not. And in some ways, I'm going to everyone. I've just insulted both Republicans and Democrats, and the last time I insult the environmentalists as well, of which I was once. I think of myself, and this we've had energy and climate change has actually been really detrimental, right? Because it's created, or at least contributed to that polarization that we see between left and right. Because in some ways, the right sees clean energy, we get tax and subsidy and higher cost and full of stuff that the right hates at some level. So it's all been about what to do this because of climate change, right? That's been the kind of the messaging around the whole of the argument has basically been captured by the environmental movement, at least in terms of clean energy, and so many benefits. Which
Texas is for clean energy.
No, God, no. And you look in China and you look in, these guys are building a case that just puts the West to shame, right? And they're not, they climate once, right? They're raw economic, right? Lower cost, better capability, right? And actually it's just food for all the other use cases that they need energy for, right? You want to build a gas plant, well, good luck if you do it in less than 3 years, right? You want to build nukes, well, 10 years if you're lucky. And this stuff you can build battery and solar farms, in 6 on. I mean, it's just.
There was a Ember World Electricity or Energy. They had this diagram of you bring in one container ship of solar panels, you get for the next 30 years, you get hundreds and hundreds of ships worth of fossil fuel equivalent energy from this one container. So you've eliminated hundreds of tanker ships of oil or natural gas or coal, hundreds and hundreds. So, and at the end of 30 years, the solar doesn't stop making energy. It just doesn't make 100%, maybe makes 70%. And you can sell it to like rural areas where, the village just put solar panels at the roof of their huts. And still
you can rewrite and you can remanufacture it. I think we'll things for its life, right? When we have robotic labor and whatever to remake atoms and molecules in solar panel, will essentially just go around cycle after cycle, right? Unless we get fusion or some other further on. But that's the interesting point you make about the issue, because the mistake people make about these things are the kind of cascading impacts, right? And how they kind of intersect. And shipping actually is a really interesting area where we 2020, 2021, some of that was specifically at the intersection, well, shipping, and the intersection of disruption to transportation, the disruption to agriculture, and the disruption to energy, right? And actually, when those three disruptions, you get a transfer. I mean, pretty much most of what we ship are either fossil fuels, cars and car parts, and agricultural products, right? And when those three industries are disrupted, you don't anymore. So then that robotic labor or artificial labor, and therefore no other than energy cost. You'll see much more distributed manufacturing emerge. There's no point in centralizing it in Asia, Vietnam, or wherever it centralized. So you're going to see both a distribution of, but also just a massive reduction in sending stuff around the world. Right? Yeah.
Executive from a grain company that animals, every kind of animals, from fish to cows. By 2040, there'll be dairy cows.
Right.
It's just €1 bet. But
yeah.
I hope to win it.
I would win it. I mean, actually, dairy are the easiest things to disrupt, right? We have, we can produce milk proteins through precision fermentation. They're competitive now. It's not difficult to do. And bear in mind that most dairy is not actually whole. It's powder that goes into our protein, our snacks, or it's in all kinds of other products. And its majority is an ingredient into it. Actually, it's super easy to disrupt that market. And it won't take much for that kind of spiral. One of the first to go would be the
global leapfrog. You mentioned that solar wind battery superpower will allow less developed countries to leapfrog traditional barriers. Which regions or nations are currently positioned to win this race to the top and become stellar societies first?
Yeah. I quickly mean by stellar, would that frame the answer? So, I mean, Tony and I, my co-founder of RethinkX, published a book earlier this year called Stellar. And really, just part of that book, I mean, it's what the reason for picking the stellar metaphor is we'd explain the metaphor of a fire, right? We need a constant inputs from outside, right? Land, labor, capital. We need to keep feeding the fire in order to produce the output that we want, the light and the heat from the fire. And along with that, we get these horrible toxic outputs in the form of kind of smoke and ashes and so forth. And that's basically the model that we've had since the dawn of, it's been dependent on scarce external inputs into that system, right? And those inputs essentially, another way of thinking of them are people and planet. The reason for the stellar analogy or metaphor is that we see much more like the sun, right? You need a lot of materials, a lot of inputs to create a kind of big point at which the system kind of ignites like a sun and just produces output for no input. Like a star can produce output for billions of years with no further inputs. Essentially, it has what it needs, inside it. And that's, the most simple solar panel, for instance, is a stellar technology, right? You need a lot of intelligence, a lot of energy, a lot of labor, a lot of materials to build it. But once you've built it, it will produce energy with no further input for 30 or 50 years, right? Artificial intelligence, actually, and robotics have the same dynamics, right? And actually, when you have labor and you have energy, right, you can essentially, the system becomes self-designing, self-improving, self-repairing, self-building. And that's why we talk about a stellar system is at a certain point, the atoms and molecules of materials that's required to get you to this kind of ignition point, creates a world that essentially can produce ever increasing amounts of knowledge improves with no further inputs. And the only input is from outside the Earth to run the whole system. And that's available in abundant quantities, at least compared to our needs. And so and I've forgotten the question. I went so far off.
Well, I just wanted to mention that point that you were making, we will be making nature at the molecular level, atomic molecular level, instead of these huge, big components putting together to make a product. We'll be making things like fruits and trees and animals.
It's a different world. I mean, it's biological capabilities massively enhanced, artificial labor, artificial intelligence, or abundance. I mean, it's just a world will different when we have those things in place. And actually, in some ways, people are no longer then exploited inputs into and the argument we make in the book is that then changes everything, right? That our world is,
Exactly, because nature builds things in a way that it makes better for everything else around it. And we build things to make a disaster for everybody else. So hopefully
Yeah,
we'll stop doing that.
yeah. I don't think that's the intention, but that's the outcome of
That's the
what we do.
outcome.
But we kind of inadvertently stumbled the world. Look, let's not damn it. It's brought us incredible progress and incredible prosperity over time. We use an analogy look of the caterpillar and the butterfly in terms of the transformation we're going to see. And let's not forget that you need a caterpillar to have a butterfly, right? And
You have to
we
go
have
through
to, yeah. But now we have technologies available to us,
Right.
so we no longer need that world, right? And as growth will change how we organize society, will change our political, economic, social structures, our governance structures, right? All change how we deal with the problems we face and actually the nature of the problems that we face. And it will change us, we think, as humans.
Yeah.
It'll change us. There's an advantage to some of the behaviors we display that we might think of as antisocial, greed and aggression, so have an advantage in the system we're in today that might not have. If you look at all kinds of domains, ecology to geopolitics, or times where competition is the optimal in terms of creating a competitive advantage, and there are times when collaboration is the optimal strategy. And I guess in the world that's based on harnessing scarce resources, competition has been the essence of that system. There's no choice, right? We're constantly competing. It's kind of grow or get outgrown, right? And exploit or get exploited. And that's been the dynamic that's driven us. We're coming to a world, basically collaboration has an advantage, right? It's a system that's based on information, and information is abundant, as energy and so, and it's collaboration and shared learning has a clear advantage. So we think all kinds of things beyond just the technologies.
So the regions might become the first stellar societies.
Yeah, so I think it's got to be those on the edge. I mean, you mentioned this earlier, how those on the edge have an advantage. It's really difficult for this to happen in Western Europe or in US or places that sort of we'd think of as like those that have kind of done well. There's too much incumbency, too much inertia to just move track the world to even imagine something beyond. So, it's the Chinese car companies outcompeted the legacy car. The reason that we all in the technology space from the edge, right? There's a huge and clean sheet. So where? Well, it's those places that have the capacity, right? That have capability to do. China, maybe parts of it, certainly the Middle East, other parts of Asia, Singapore, maybe, and also the capital, the access to in order to do this. There's some, yes, it's those places that essentially have the ability to think. We know actually is kind of Darwinian in essence, right? And adaptive can actually do that as things become more unstable and societies lose their adaptive capacity. I would argue that's what now in the West is that as polarization grows and the issues grow, we're actually losing our adaptive capacity. We're spending on Band-Aid and patch up the old system, and we just have no interest in actually fundamentally transforming the system.
Now let's turn to the rupture point and the human cost. Geopolitics, stranded assets, and the turbulence of mass job displacement. This transition isn't frictionless. Your work has addressed the adverse consequences, including job losses and the destruction of trillions of dollars of value. The Great Stranding. You identified a large and rapidly expanding global financial bubble around conventional energy assets. For legacy investors, how immediate is the risk of these assets becoming completely stranded? And what is the moral hazard of trying to keep them alive?
I mean, it depends what industry. You mentioned energy there. It happens quickly, right? It's really in one the vicious and the verb kicked off now. We're kind of beyond the point at which it's operating. And move fossil and technology to clean energy technology. Be a move to distributed production as well, right? More dynamic grids. And if the grid infrastructure isn't changed, or new, more distributed grids will be built outside, essentially behind the meter. So there's a real risk of these. A Western incumbent perspective, you'd say, well, we can put money in, we can resist, push back against change, and for a period of time, right? And actually, it can all look great. You can actually add problems for you. It's exactly what's happening for some wind and batteries in the West. Actually, we're not getting them, right. They're actually adding costs to us right now because of the way we're integrating them and conceiving of the type of system we're building. But the problem is, and this is kind of a thesis of disruption, is that someone somewhere else will build the right kind of system with the superabundance of super low cost of energy that you get with such a system, right? And they'll outcompete. And so, yes, you can resist, but you do that, and your whole economy becomes uncompetitive, and everyone has exposure to the wrong paradigm. So they're operating within the wrong possibility space in terms of the innovation and creativity that they're displaying, essentially in the wrong direction. So you suffer it, and you can see a profound shift the whole power structures of the whole world. And those periods of times are messy, very hazard, moral and other, the kind of jobs that will get destroyed along the way. And we do protect people through this, not protect the businesses and industries that a lot of lobbying.
Creating all these dinosaur industries are going to be outcompeted whenever
Zombie
at some
industry,
point.
yeah, no, for sure. And if you do use superabundant labor, right, you have a capacity to, you have to protect people through that period of time. You have the wherewithal to actually manage the transformation. You get your toast, essentially. And it's much more painful.
Let's turn to job displacement. The information, energy, transportation, and soon labor with AI and robotics means massive job displacement. What is the biggest failure point of current government planning regarding inevitable mass unemployment in fossil fuels and automotive sectors? What should the social contract look like in a stellar society?
I mean, it's a big question that everything is wrong with the way seeding of this trend. Look, I mean, we can argue about on how quickly AI and robotics disrupt human life, but over some period of time, it's going to outcompete us with in terms of pretty much everything we do today, right? Almost all jobs, right, will disappear. Maybe not professional, but pretty much, at least materially, jobs will go. Form of we think of them today, right? And we can see that, right? And see it enormously liberating, right? It's liberation, right? But it's only liberation from labor if we have some other way to kind of meet our needs, to allow us to do the things that we want to do, right? And it's true liberation at that point. The problem is now we have no what's coming, and we're making no preparation to get there. But look, if you do have a system, as I've described, and we did a book, if you're interested in more detail, if you do have a system that is kind of like the sun, that is producing output for no further input, there is essentially no cost to that, right? I mean, if it was privately owned, right, you'd want a return on capital, and you'd have someone somewhere in Silicon or China controlling the world's labor, essentially, but it would be artificial labor, right? It'd be a hugely unequal world, right? But there's no advantage to that. Right, that adds cost. You had two nations or cities side, and one had our kind of current ownership, private ownership model. It have higher cost output than a society next door that actually had a ownership model. I mean, look, it was like the sun, right? We don't own the sun, and we all benefit from the abundant output that we get from it. Right? And so, as this competitive changes, right? What was an asset? What becomes a liability? What advantage can become a disadvantage? And private ownership without competed any other for the model we've tried. And that's why we've seen it back to Sumerian times, right? We've seen private ownership, right? It's part of the package that came with the Neolithic Revolution, right? These things have an advantage in that kind of production paradigm. Gives the right incentives, progress. It drives progress. It drives competitive advantage, and it helps organize the economy. In a stellar world, right, eventually land, labor, capital are embodied in the technology. Right? They're part of the system. They're embodied in the robots, the AI, the energy system, and don't need further outputs. In organizing outputs, actually key to economics, efficient allocation of scarce inputs. It's about the optimization of the utilization of abundant outputs. So it's totally the other way up, the economics of this. And new ownership models become entirely possible. And in fact, they don't just become possible, they have advantage. Right? So this is not kind of utopian or wishful thinking. This is said with an understanding of competitive advantage, right, which is the only thing that really ever drives change. And so we could have people benefit from, say, output rights, right, or any other that people are right to output or that output, or whatever model we choose. Current model won't work. And if we don't labor to sell in exchange for our needs, we're really screwed. Right? We're in a really difficult situation. And so we will need to change those organizing structures, the economic model, politicals, and so on, to take advantage. But it doesn't have to be scary. It could be hugely beneficial. But we could all have access to superabundant energy and labor to do pretty much anything we want to do, and the capacity to do it. and freed from, essentially, if we get it right, from having to sell our labor to do a job we don't do. We'll be able to do something that, my God, I mean, and again, it's not just a case of having more leisure time, leisure expanding, and we conceive of it. We have this incredible toolkit with which we can do pretty much anything. So it's almost on how we'll live and what to do, and where we'll find meaning and purpose. And so on. I answered your question entirely, but it's just a transformation is on the scale I've seen before.
Turning to geopolitical entropy, the shift from fossil fuels, which inherently foster competition and exploitation for expansion societies, to distributed solar, wind, battery, superpower, changes the global power map. How quickly do nations whose geopolitical power is built entirely on oil, like Russia or Saudi Arabia, lose their leverage?
It depends on what they can answer that question. So, I mean, we will see declines in acceleration in terms of transportation disruption once we have vehicle autonomy. That seems very clear. And increasing, the clean energy. So fossil fuels will be felt rapidly, just be outcompeted. And so countries dependent on them, then it depends what they do in response. We'd argue that Russia doesn't seem to be showing any signs of adapting, right? They're clinging on to the old order. Arguably, that's that's what it's about, right? It's the old order. Somewhere like Saudi Arabia, Middle Eastern regions have the capacity to in fact, to showing signs of doing so. And actually, they have super abundant solar resources, right? They'll have some of the lowest cost, on the planet. So absolutely the capacity and capability. None of the kind of issues that we face in the West in driving through change. So it really depends on what, I think the routes, divergent pathways are to them. Some have a higher likelihood of taking a good pathway. Some look like they're on the fast up. It will.
Russia is doubling down, and it's not going to end pretty for them.
Yeah. Big news.
They have lots of other minerals, and they have a lot of resources.
They do, and they develop them, and they at least maintain some of the wealth. Because we're going for an era where we've got to build out of this new system, right? So you'll need materials to build all the clean energy, to build the robots, to build AI and so on. Before it needs none. You have the molecules that kind of embodied and within the system, and there'll be a huge opportunity during that period. And that is the picture for investors is the interesting one. Is the next 20 years, there's going to be extraordinary creation of value, but also extraordinary loss of wealth. And I think it's going to be the most bifurcated market you've ever seen. Companies are destroyed, and we're seeing that to some degree. We're not quite seeing the destruction of businesses yet, but we're seeing, you're just seeing this huge.
Yeah, there's probably just one car in America pretty soon, and then maybe not.
Yeah, and maybe in that world, car manufacturing is just totally producing a robo-taxi for a fleet, right? You don't really care about brand. You don't really care. What you care about is the platform and the service, and and the headaches. There's a lot of people that will seem crazy, right? But always make the argument. I'm sure if you want to drive into the future, you'll be able to. You probably won't be able to insurance to do it on a public road, but there are plenty of horses for enjoyment. We just don't see many people using them for transport, right? And I think it'll be the same with
the role of philanthropy and mindset required to navigate exponential change. You're not just a theorist; you're an investor and the founder of the Tellius Matter Foundation, focusing on influencing the flows of capital, funding the narrative. Why did you choose to fund research other than directly funding a technology startup? What is the comparative strategic advantage of investing in understanding and the disruption over investing in creating the disruption?
I do both. The two answers. To invest at least. I do divert a lot of capital actually into philanthropic ends. Tony and I didn't want to set up RethinkX. We kind of resisted for a long time, but no one else was producing the kind of research that we wanted to produce that captured not just that accelerated speed of change, but actually the nature of change. Which is, I think, the essence of what we've been doing over the last 9 years since we founded RethinkX. And I think doing that is partly we couldn't not do it. The research wasn't out there, but I think understanding how transformation happens properly and seeing that possibility space that's emerging that is not the world that we're living in today. It's critical to the creation of it. So in terms of the trajectory that the world, I think investing in a handful of technologies that help us take that path would be great. But I think actually creating a vision of a transformation that's coming and the risks that are emerging as we go down that path is actually profoundly more valuable when it doesn't. I think, what we see with a lot of even technology companies are, some at the kind of these changes is that they don't fully understand the nature of the change that's what we see with the applications of AI today, right? We're looking at how do we replace the things we do today with AI. That's how we're applying it in business and in an industry. And that's how we're designing AI agents and products. And that's all well and good, right? But it's not the real opportunities in doing entirely new things, just replacing us, but redesigning some practices and creating just new possibilities. I think that was the space we envisioned because we accelerate the change and lead to both less suffering. That was our motivation. And if someone else would do it, very happily go back to our day jobs. But so far, we haven't seen anyone else really coming along and doing what we've been doing.
Talk about investor anti-fragility. You mentioned the need to develop anti-fragility, the ability to lean into change and grow stronger. What are two practical actions an average institutional investor needs to take today to make their portfolio anti-fragile against the RethinkX predicted disruption timeline?
I just love that word, anti-fragile, from his book of the same name. And obviously what it is something that's anti-fragile is to get through change or under stress or through pressure, right? Rather than fragile, which kind of breaks under pressure. And I love that actually from a human perspective, business perspective, right? We can learn to lean into change, to welcome it, understanding that it's that change and problems that we face are the very things that lead to development, that make us stronger. I think a lot of ease, and I think the transformation that we're facing would be much easier. We'd see a lot less resistance. I would argue that the political movements left and right now are all based in fear of change at some level. And I think we'll see that as we get into this transformation over the next handful of years. The capacity to develop anti-fragility is, it's not just from a business, but it's critical to surfing the wave of change. It's critical from a human that we don't go do dumb stuff and start resisting this or hiding from it or creating division and polarization even greater extent today. That capacity to welcome change, critical. So that I guess for a leader at any level, whether business or in any other part of society, is to open your eyes and see this, to understand both the possibilities and opportunities emerging, but also to understand the risks, right? So it's really see it, and then if you don't see it, you can't do it. So I think that's it. Just open your whole picture, understand the transformative nature of change. And that's really how you create anti-fragility, when you learn to lean into
the new operating system. RethinkX states its mission is to help create the foundation for a new operating system for humanity. If technology gives us the way, what is the new story or shared vision humanity needs to find the will to get there?
I mean, Tony and I would argue that's exactly that vision, right? That there are 3 levels of thinking necessary to get to that place that we call a world, that world of just extraordinary possibilities, right? So it's not a done deal. But I don't want people thinking we're some kind of utopians, that we don't understand, how we don't after we do. We thought deeply about this. But there are 3 levels of change, right? There's a technological, there's a sort of production system level, and that kind of underpins things. And that's inevitable, right? We think at a point in time that the physics and the economics of stellar technologies, i.e. clean energy, robotics, AI, the physics and the economics just outcompete all extractive technologies, right? So there's an inevitability to that transformation. Sure, people are going to try and resist it in parts of the world. Sure, there's going to be issues with it, but the physics and economics make it inevitable at this point that they'll outcompete, right? So the technological coming, right, and you can argue about time something level is what we call when you refer to the operating system there, we refer to the organizing system. It's how we organize society, the economic system, the political systems, culture, all that kind of stuff, how we organize a centralized, hierarchical, top control type structure we have today, or a much more kind of distributed network and node type, so kind of shared learning network. We think that we'll have to well, to capitalize on the opportunities that are emerging, we'll have to reorganize essentially how we organize society. Right? And it's not a case of designing it. We will see people experiment in parts of the world at kind of city level and regional level. And the best, right, for this production paradigm will essentially compete. And that's what we saw happen through the Neolithic Revolution, right? We've tried of ownership model. We've tried all kinds of political system. Right? We've tried all kinds of ways of organizing society. And it's a Darwinian process, right? The best forms win out. And perfect forms, they're not perfectly adapted, but they're better than the others, right? We've seen that happen over. That's the second level of the change to the organizing system, how we organize society. And the third level is how we are, how we think, the kind of world we have, the mindset we have, how we interact, and so on and so forth. I mean, that's a subject of a whole much longer discussion, but we kind of touch on it in the book Fellow, and it's an area that personally fascinates.
How do we react to it? Or do we embrace the future?
Yeah.
James, your work challenges our deepest about scarcity and the future. Thank you for giving us a blueprint for this extraordinary transformation.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me on. I very much appreciate it.
I thoroughly enjoyed it.
I haven't even looked at my clock. It was twice as long as we were expecting. I apologize.
Yes. Well, we had too much fun talking.
That was fun. Yeah, I enjoyed the conversation.
I hope we'll be able to get more of your colleagues on the show in the future.
Absolutely. Certainly Adam Doyle you'll enjoy speaking to.
That's James Arbib, co-founder of RethinkX and author of Stellar. To our audience, this is more than just a disruption. It's a choice. To understand the speed and scale of this shift, visit RethinkX.com and check out their latest reports. If this conversation was profound enough to change your course, hit that like button and subscribe to Clean Titans. We'll see you next time.
The insights and solutions we discuss here are crucial for a cleaner future. They're about a fundamental shift in mindset. We believe that interviews like this are so profound, they can change the course of your life. If this conversation moved you, hit that subscribe button to join the community that's building the sustainable future. Thank you for watching. Like and tell your friends about Clean Titans and consider supporting us on Buy Me a Coffee. And we'll see you next time on Clean Titans.